picking up from where we left off last time, we're trying to understand the refinement of religious thought, and in particular we looked at Swanson, and he was kind of articulating the point that if you look at the creation of the high God, this kind of monotheistic conception, it seems to parallel the social relationships and the embedded hierarchies that exist in the social structure. So in many ways we're mirroring, we're projecting that social reality into the construct of the gods. Now, also what Swanson says about the high gods, because he tries to study the high gods. Well, first off, what is a high god? How do we articulate in simple terms? So, yeah.
Over 6 foot.
Well, so a high god, in many ways, is a creative agent. Yeah, controlling agent, creative agent, and how Swanson kind of articulated it. Well, the high god is always supreme, always stands apart from the other spirits, the other deities, the other gods. So it is above all other entities, divine entities. And another obviously important aspect is that creative element. In all the mythologies, there is often a high god that starts creation, creates everything from nothing and produces kind of reality. Now, another common theme, if you look at the mythologies related to high gods, is often high gods are distant. They're not immanent in the kind of created world or the earth. And as a result of that, there are very few instances where high gods are deified or worshipped or rituals kind of performed to them. More often, they exist and manifest in the mythology. Now, Swanson just sums up some kind of classifications of high gods, and he says basically, if you look at certain high gods, there are, first off, single act high gods that simply produce, so a single act high god is the high god that simply produces one act, such as bringing this world into existence, creating reality. And if you look at the Aztec tradition, often when the high god has produced reality, some narrations assert that the god is dismembered, but often what happens is the high god can disappear or be destroyed through that process of that single huge act of creating reality and existence. So they just perform one act. The other type is a restricted high god, which again just simply means they perform one or two very specific acts, create reality, or create as well the lesser gods that control the natural universe. The unknown high god is simply the high god that created everything, is the source of everything, but is unknown. And the active high god, what would be an example of the active high god?
Christian God.
Sorry?
Christian God.
So yes, Yahweh, for instance, is a personal God that intervenes in our lives, that basically sends us guidance and laws and rules and moral guidings. So that's an active high God, participates in creation in some way, is transcendent but immanent in that way. Okay. Yeah, that's all right. Turning to Schmidt now, he articulates that basically, for him, monotheism and the conception of the high God actually originated in early societies. So this is going away from something like Swanson argued. Swanson pretty much argued the refinement of monotheism, polytheism occurs when we become more complex in our societies. Our societies become complex, our religious systems become complex. But he asserts that there actually is instances of monotheistic conceptions within early hunter-gatherer tribes. So in particular, he cites the example of some African tribes. And what he says is they believed in this kind of sky god. So that was the creator god within the mythology. This high god created everything. But what happens is, because that high god is distant, is external to nature, to people's lives, what happens amongst these African tribes is where they start to basically adopt spirits. Spirits control the natural world. Then these spirits become the spirits of dead ancestors. This is where ancestor cult worship forms. And eventually we have then them turning into gods. So what he suggests is the high god is the first conception, and then the polytheistic conception of many gods gets layered into the religious system. Now, another kind of example that we want to touch on is the decline of the high god. So in Hinduism, we have an interesting example. Brahma is obviously the creator god. Now, Hinduism is constructed on a triad. You have the creator god Brahma, you have Vishnu, the preserver or the sustainer, and then you have Shiva, which is basically the destroyer or transformer. And that's basically the Trinity within the kind of Hindu conception. What's interesting is by the 4th or 6th century, Brahma kind of disappears from the kind of popular consciousness. He's not worshipped, he's not kind of venerated, he disappears, he loses popularity, he declines. So why is that perhaps the case? So if we look at the mythology explains that the reason why Brahma declines is because Brahma became arrogant. So there was an incident where Brahma was arguing with Vishnu, who is the most powerful. And they went to Shiva to try to kind of arbitrate. And Shiva said, look, the most powerful is the one that can find my beginning or end. So both of them start searching for Shiva's beginning and end. Vishnu realizes very quickly that Shiva does not have a beginning and end. He comes back and narrates that to Shiva. But Brahma is arrogant, supposedly, and doesn't want to accept that. So he plots a plan, and he basically gets a lotus leaf and says he took this from Shiva's head. Now Shiva knew, as well as Vishnu knew, that this was a lie. And so Shiva cursed Brahma and said, you will never be worshipped again. So that's the mythology, right? That kind of explains the myth of it. But what in actuality happened? Why does such a central figure in the Rig Vedas just decline? So some have suggested it was grounded actually in an aspect of utility. So if you think about it, by performing the function of creating, that kind of is a job that is done. You create and that's it. While Vishnu and Shiva still maintain function because they transform. So in essence, people have utility. It's natural to refer to Vishnu, to refer to Shiva, because that's connected to your daily needs and life. While Brahma is disconnected because it's a creator god that doesn't really impact my social life, my needs. So ultimately, this may to some degree explain the decline. Yep.
I'm not 100% certain, but isn't it also true that everything is Brahma? Everything has Brahma almost imbued in it. Am I correct in saying?
Obviously, don't confuse Brahman with Brahma. So Brahma is a polytheistic god. Brahman is actually a different concept, but we will kind of address that. Okay, let's look at some other examples. An interesting example of an early monotheistic conception in a very complex society is Aten. So Aten obviously exists in Egyptian mythology. Now, what's interesting first off about Aten, if you look at the last point, Aten is never depicted in human form, while all the other gods are often depicted in some kind of humanized form. So what does that tell us? That Aten is not humanized, but all the other lower gods are humanized. What can we infer from that?
Is that like with given human attributes can mean that they're sort of flawed and a bit less, but if there's nothing like human, we can't comprehend it or be likened to human in any way?
It's a good point. So basically, Aten was seen as different. So Atan stood apart. That's why he was not humanized, because he was this high God, this monotheistic, all-powerful God. He was the creator God. So there was a distinction in his depiction as well as how he was referred to. So he was both masculine and feminine, while the other gods were either feminine or male. So these weren't applied to Atan. There's a distinction that there is this gap between Atan and the lower gods, the other gods. So this is why some have articulated, well, this is this early kind of conception of monotheism, right? Now, the social reality, Swanson will say, well, this mirrors the social reality of Egyptian society. In what way? So obviously, in Egypt, we have a kind of monarch monotheism, right? You have the all-powerful pharaoh, and all worldly power rests with his absolute power, his absolute word, his law. And so that absolute power is projected, of course, into the conception of the high God. So, in essence, there's that aspect. Now, what's also interesting is that Atan not necessarily declines, but there is this point where people stop to kind of venerate Atan, worship Atan, or basically perform rituals. And the reason for that is because if you look at as well, always in the depictions of Atan, he's basically the solar disk god, and always there are rays of light coming from him. What do you think those rays of light symbolize? So supposedly they symbolize nourishment, that he is nourishing the natural world. He's kind of animating and facilitating the whole universe, right? Now, the problem then is what happens in Egyptian society when you have a drought, when you have a famine, and you're suffering, and this distant God is not really alleviating it. So again, this is perhaps where lower gods are worshipped, venerated, because they're accessible in nature. Any questions on that? Cool. I know we're moving through things quite fast. Okay, so another example is within the Hindu hymns found in the Rig Veda. Now, what's interesting is the red portion of the hymn. Now, how do we interpret this? It says, who knows and who can say whence it was born and whence came his creation? The gods are later than this world's creation. So who knows then whence it first came into being? What is this trying to say? Because this is really interesting, right? Because Hinduism, polytheistic system, yet it's saying the gods came after creation. And then it alludes to something else. What is this? So this is a different form of monotheism known as substance monism. And substance monism might actually be the purest conception of monotheism. Now, why might it be the purest conception of monotheism? One of the key things it does is it negates duality. Yeah? If you look at the Abrahamic tradition has God or creator and creation. All right? This is a simple duality. God exists outside of nature, outside of the world he created. So he created this physical reality, and God is transcendent. The problem with this is God supposedly is an eternal entity that has no limitation. So how can a physical entity, creation, coexist with this unlimited entity? It doesn't make sense. So substance monism asserts that actually there can only be one reality, and that is that singular entity, whatever you want to call him, Brahman, and that entity is the only thing that exists. Everything else does not exist. So in essence, it's negating this separation between the physical and the supernatural. So again, this is a different way of conceiving that singular conception of a God. Right, any questions on that? Cool. Okay, so moving more towards the Abrahamic tradition. The Abrahamic tradition, obviously, as we all probably know, is the tradition that is asserted as perhaps the kind of original conception of monotheism, right? God revealed this revelation, this truth to the first human, or created the first human, and that is the first message. There is a one God, and he created everything. He is the source of everything. He created everything from nothing. And then you have different prophets come. Now, what kind of monotheism asserts is that obviously, yes, you have God, and he revealed to the first person the truth, and you have different prophets, Noah, Abraham, whatever, Moses. Now, what the Abrahamic tradition asserts is that polytheism somehow forms after, during this period. So supposedly, there is one absolute God. Remember, this is conceptualized as an essentialist truth that exists outside of social construction. And therefore, what happens is, somehow, polytheism forms during it. Now, we know that really, this doesn't seem to be the case. Because if we look at the archaeological evidence, if we look at even how the Abrahamic traditions were socially constructed, they were kind of heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism. So, the prophet Zoroaster, what did he do? Before the prophet Zoroaster, the Persian pantheon was full of many, many, many different gods. It was a polytheistic system. He took all those gods and condensed it into a duality. His duality was the idea that actually what you have is two co-eternal entities. You have Ari Mazda and you have Arima. Now, what these are two co-eternal forces. Ari Mazda is the force, the creative force of good. So all good in this universe comes from Ari Mazda. Opposite to him is his twin, which is Ahriman, who is basically the destructive force. So all evil, all corruption, earthquakes, cancer, illness, all come from Ahriman. So what this creates is a strict co-eternal duality. This duality then, as we know, influences the Abrahamic, because now you have the duality of God and creation. Also, within the Abrahamics, what you have is a form of mitigated duality. So this is absolute duality. This is co-eternal. This force is equal to this force, right? And what's interesting in Zoroastrianism is that the human agent has to make a decision, has a moral dilemma, a moral choice. Do I align myself with the forces of good? So this is happening at the cosmological level. This battle between the good God, bad God, is a cosmological battle. The human agent has to decide at the moral level, what side am I on? So, and this is again connected to the salvation of his soul. So if he aligns with the good God, then his soul is saved and pure. So why then are we saying that the Abrahamic faiths is basically a form of mitigated duality? What do we mean by that? Any ideas? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Because the Abrahamic religions take that principle and just say, instead of it being two gods fighting, it's just one God, and then the bad stuff is what to avoid. Okay, so you have the singular good God. In some ways, what makes it a mitigated duality is that sometimes the good God, or the singular God, this all-powerful God, has a lesser enemy. So this devil is not co-eternal, but has supernatural powers that is fighting this God. And what of the individual? We have to make a choice, right? Do we want to side with the true God and save ourselves, or be damned? So there is a battle for our soul. There is a battle for our soul. So what we see is that Zoroastrianism
heavily influenced the formation of the Abrahamic tradition. So this attempt to kind of say that the Abrahamic traditions is an essentialist truth ignores the kind of social construction of the Abrahamic faiths. Are there any questions on that? Cool. We'll come back to elements of this, especially next week when we look at the social construction of the devil. Okay, so just looking at this idea of social construction through an illustrated example. So Yahweh is the monotheistic conception pretty much of the Abrahamic traditions. Now, if we look at Yahweh, what's interesting about the construct of Yahweh is that Yahweh began as a lower god. So actually it was a localized tribal god that was seen as a protector or warrior god. Sometimes there's narrations that it was the god of storms. It was not this all-powerful, absolute God that we have today. So Yahweh does not emerge fully formed as this absolute all-powerful God. He evolves into this all-powerful God. So what we see is actually he was one of the lesser gods in the Canaanite pantheon, and even above him, above Yahweh, you have El, who was the father of Yahweh. So there is even a higher God than Yahweh. So how does Yahweh, this lesser God, this local tribal God, become this all-powerful God? So it has to have been a social construct, right? Society had to create it. So how does it go about that? Well, early Israelites were not strictly monotheistic. They had local deities fused with utility, just like other societies. Now what starts to happen is that they experience a kind of nationalization. So a lot of the spread out tribes of the Israelites want to unite together. So they unite the kind of Israelite people. Now to do this, they need a symbol. So they take from, when they leave the kind of that area, they take Yahweh with them, and he becomes this elevated symbol to unite the different tribes. And he becomes a symbol that they can basically elevate and basically draw their identity from, as well as perform rituals and give us laws. So also there are other social factors such as the exile from Babylon, that kind of war and persecution. So all of these things create a shift. So Yahweh goes from tribal God to national God, ultimately. So these things play a role. Now, what's also important is after experiencing all of these things, we see that the Israelites in some ways externalize their social reality. So what does that mean? It's basically a projection of their collective experience. They experience persecution, they experience exile, they experience war, they experience kingship. They're trying to unite and gain a sense of unity. So all of these things then are projected into this need for a singular, binding, absolute entity. Now, after that externalization, the generations that followed internalize this truth. So they're born into the representation that Yahweh is this absolute powerful God. So it's not challenged, it's not questioned. He is an absolute fixed entity. So they're kind of born and socialized into that. Any questions? Yeah.
When the Israelites today, any leader of Abrahamic tradition would say the Canaanites just simply misunderstood Yahweh's role, and that the Abrahamic religions are in fact being correct, and it isn't a social construct, it was just that the Canaanites misunderstood.
You could try to argue that as an essentialist truth, but what we see from archaeological evidence is that Yahweh was fused with other gods as well. I didn't go into the details of it, but Yahweh wasn't just taken. Aspects of Baal and other gods, the powers of these different gods were put together. So even if the Canaanites may have distorted the image of Yahweh. Yahweh doesn't start as an absolute God. He never was an absolute God. He was always a localized deity linked to utility. So that's how he formed. So it seems the evidence is that he evolved into this absolute God. There's no evidence to suggest he was fully formed as this absolute God. It seems like he was a localized entity that became a national entity. So again, it's kind of that argument of social construct, yeah.
Was it always called something like Yahweh, or did it then get given that name?
So there was local gods, initially were Yahweh, I think. And so to some degree it was taken as a localized conception, a local tribal god, and elevated. So I'm not too sure if there was ever different names. It could be.
What did they consider a divine warrior to be?
So it's a protector entity.
As in like a warrior, or as in like a spiritual protector?
Maybe it's beyond just symbolic, because often what you've got to understand, this was tribal society. Tribal society is lawless. There's no law. You could be attacked. There's an issue with your tribal survival. Yeah, just surviving as a tribe in this hostile environment is not easy. You're persecuted. You're attacked. So often, yeah, we've talked about gods being fixed to utility, where it's farming and it's fishing, nice, peaceful. But this is a social reality very different. This is a social reality of harshness and lawlessness. So often there are a lot of kind of gods that are constructed that function as protectors, whether it's spirit force or whether it's symbolic, I'm not 100% sure. But I kind of get what you're saying. Okay. Okay, now the main thing of the lecture, finally get there, is we want to focus on Greer's argument for polytheism. So in his 2005 book, he wrote, in a world full of gods, he tries to essentially critique monotheism. And what he's arguing in the book is that actually, if you look at polytheism, polytheism is in fact perhaps our default religious system. It's the most naturalistic, organic religious system. And the reason why it is that is because what he focuses on is the thing of basically religious experience. So the reason why polytheism is the most kind of naturalistic or default religious system is because of this concept of religious experience, which we need to kind of dissect. So what is religious experience? Simplest sense, how we encounter the divine. How do we encounter and conceptualize the divine as an individual, as a tribe, as a community, right? So if you think about it, there have been obviously billions of people. There's been millions of tribes. There's been probably thousands of societies, right? Now, all of these different billions of people have their own religious experience. They have their own distinct religious experience. So they create their own different gods, their own different spirits, and their own different kind of divinities, right? So this is their own kind of construct. So what this suggests is that the formation of divinities is basically diverse. So this is why throughout human history we have different types of gods that take different form, that have different characteristics, right? So why are there so many gods? Why is there many? Why is there many, many different gods? Why is there many, many different conceptions of a god?
There are many different experiences.
So there's many different experiences. Obviously, we're talking obviously as well, utility is a core part of it. So obviously, all these individuals have their own distinct experiences and encounters. So they construct their own kind of spirits and gods and divinities, right? So this is the creation of the many. Now what Greer is basically arguing is that if you look at polytheism, polytheism is more accommodating in its approach. So it basically allows for religious diversity and religious experience. It kind of incorporates the whole process of religious experience, because obviously the individual encounters nature, right? And when we encounter nature, what do? We construct the gods. Now that's built on elements of utility. So why is it that the fisherman constructs a sea god? Why is it that the farmer constructs maybe a sun god? All based on their human experience and need, right? So we create different gods based on our experience of nature, based on our needs, right? Now, the problem with monotheism is that monotheism is at odds with the concept of the many, right? Because monotheism asserts that there can only be one true God, and there cannot be any other beliefs. There cannot be any other spirits, not any other divinities. So it doesn't accommodate the many, is Greer's argument. So this is why polytheism for him supports this whole thing of religious experience, right? But more importantly for Greer, if you look at the formation of polytheism, polytheism did not occur in opposition. It wasn't created as a reactionary religious system. So what do we mean by that? It wasn't created in opposition. It did not emerge in opposition. So if we look at monotheism, monotheism seemingly did emerge as a counterposition to paganism, to polytheism. So it's a reactionary system. So if you take, I don't know, Islam, for example, Muhammad lived in a pagan society, and he introduced his concept of Tawheed, right? This kind of monotheistic conception. Don't worry about it too much. Now, before that, you had the Arab pagans. These different tribes, these different societies, these different peoples, all had their own beliefs and practices. Now, if you look at Arab paganism, they never ever went to war based on disagreements about the beliefs of other tribes and other peoples. So paganism, the reason why it didn't is because it accommodates the many. So if you want to worship a mountain or a rock, we're not going to go to war over that, because you can worship the many. That's just bound in nature. It's only when monotheism came, Muhammad's Tawheed, did he want to eradicate all forms of paganism. So Muhammad's Tawheed, Muhammad's monotheism, is a reaction to Arab paganism. And therefore it takes a very combative position, because Muhammad doesn't want to accept the many. There's only one true God, and you must submit to that one true God. So your belief in the mountain or the rock is false, and it's wrong, and you basically must be eradicated. That's the problem, what Greer is saying with monotheism, that it doesn't accommodate the many. Okay. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Does he talk about like pantheonic religions that do say that that do like war and raid, like Vikings?
There's elements of that. So there is, like, even within Hindu mythology, there are wars and things, but it's not. I think the way he'll break it down is, look, these Arab tribes, let's say, for example, they had war. They fought. They weren't peaceful. They had war based on socio-economic issues, tribal conflict, blood conflicts. But it was never about, you must believe and assimilate our gods. They never tried to assimilate another tribe, while Muhammad tried to assimilate their beliefs and practices under the dominion of Tawheed and Islam. I'm not 100% familiar with the kind of other traditions. Okay, so now we've got to move to Greer's example. So Greer presents a somewhat convoluted argument to prove that perhaps polytheism is more accommodating. So he calls this the one cat analogy. This is a hypothetical kind of thought exercise. It's a little bit convoluted, so I'm going to try to kind of explain it the best I can. So what Greer constructs is, he says there is this imaginary, let's say, village, and a researcher goes and visits the village and wants to ask about the beliefs in the village, in particular about feline entities. So he wants to know, do people in this village believe in feline entities? So the researcher goes to the first house, knocks on the door, and asks the question, do you believe in feline entities? The homeowner basically said, yes, there is one cat, and that cat is grey with blue eyes. Now, my parents taught me about this one true grey cat. I've also had a bit of a religious experience. I saw it once, and this is why I basically at night put out food, and in the morning it's gone. And what the homeowner says is the cat of other people, i.e. what the neighbours believe, is not real. So basically they're saying that the only cat that is real is the grey cat with blue eyes. Nothing else is real, it's just this one cat. So the researcher then goes and knocks on door number 2 and asks the same question. The homeowner basically says, yeah, I believe in one cat, but this one cat is black with yellow eyes. And he also says, I also had a religious experience. You know, I came back home, it was dark, it was night, I was drunk, and I saw the yellow eyes, and that really changed me. And from then on, I changed my life, I don't drink. And he said, basically, the cat that the other people believe, though, is evil. So he's basically saying that they're misguided in their belief. What they believe is evil. So when they put the food out at night, it's not the cat going and eating it, it's rats. Now, the third household is obviously asked the same question, and they basically say, yes, I believe in one cat, it's orange with brown eyes. But this person is a little bit more tolerant. So they say that basically, I know that the other neighbours have seen a cat, but it's not their cat, it's my cat. And they've distorted it. So one time, basically the cat jumped over the fence and went into their yard. So they saw it, but through a distorted lens. So they have knowledge of the cat. They know that there is a cat. They know that it's furry and has a tail and has legs, but it's the orange cat that they saw, my cat, basically. Then he goes to the fourth householder and knocks on the door, asks, do you believe in feline entities? The homeowner says, no, there is no such thing as cats. Basically, it's all kind of made up. Anyone that believes in a cat is basically delusional. Cats do not exist. How can you have one cat that is grey, that is black, and that is orange? Then the researcher goes to the last house and asks obviously the same question. The homeowner basically says, well, actually, in this village, there are 3 cats. There's a grey cat, a black cat, and an orange cat. So there are many cats, and they have their own territory, they have their own feeding patterns, and all 3 of them come and I feed them. Okay, bit convoluted, and we will dissect that. So what is that example that Greer puts forward trying to illustrate? What is his kind of point? So in essence, what he's trying to explain is the restrictive nature of monotheistic conception. So if you look at it, obviously the first 3 householders are monotheists or monophilists, yeah? Now, basically, house number 1 basically says that there only one cat exists. That is their cat. Their cat is the only real cat, which in essence, they're negating the beliefs of the other people and their belief, right? So, in essence, the only cat that is real is the grey cat. There is no other cat apart from the grey cat. So we would term this existence exclusive monotheism, because they are only accepting a singular truth, their truth, and negating and rejecting any other truth conveyed by anyone else. The second householder basically also believes that there is only one cat, but they believe that the beliefs of the other are misguided. The beliefs of the other are evil. So in essence, this is value exclusive monotheism, where they're imposing their own value system to negate the belief of the other. They're basically saying it's evil, it's corrupt, it's misguided, while I have the true belief. The third homeowner is what we would term inclusive monotheist. So they're kind of acknowledging, yeah, homeowner 1, homeowner 2, they saw a cat, but it was my cat they saw. And in essence, what happened was they distorted it. So maybe when the cat went over the fence, it was dark and the person was drunk. So he didn't see it properly. So what he thought was a cat that was black with yellow eyes was in fact, because he distorted it, it was actually my cat, which is orange with brown eyes. So this is basically inclusive monotheism. Obviously, the fourth householder is an atheist, and the fifth householder is the polytheist. So in essence, from this, what we can see is that polytheism is more accommodating to religious experience and religious difference, while monotheism is restrictive, right? So let's try to so one point that I should mention, obviously, because polytheism is accommodating, what Greer argues is that monotheism has to justify its belief, and the way it justifies its belief that there is only one real cat is through creating what Greer calls special pleadings. Any idea what he means by that? So special pleadings, to show that there is only one true cat and it's my cat, basically the monotheist will basically have to say, well, the reason why I believe in one true God is because I've received revelations, I've received sacred texts, I've received prophets and miracles, and those are special pleadings that make my belief the true belief. So if we look at it from another perspective of the many gods constructed, take for again a hypothetical example. Let's say if you have an individual in a community, and that community and that individual worships one god, Ganesh. Then you have another community and another individual, they all worship one god, Kali. Now the problem that this creates is that each has to account for the belief of the other. Now how do you account for, let's say if you're the individual that believes in Ganesh, how do you account for those people that basically believe in Kali? So the problem with this idea of existent exclusive monotheism is that my God is true. My God is the only God. And so to justify that, basically to show that my God is the true God, and the reason why that's correct is because, again, special pleadings. I received miracles, revelation, and all these things. Now the problem with that, simply put, is that all societies, all probably religions, have special pleadings. So Muslims will say, my God is true. Christians will say, my God is true. And they've got their own revelation. They've got their own miracles. They've got their own prophets. So all of these different societies and communities have their own special pleadings to justify their singular belief. But the problem is, it doesn't account for religious experience, diverse religious experience. And that's the whole of what Greer is basically saying. Are there any questions on that? I know I ran through it a little fast, but that's his argument. He suggests that basically polytheism accommodates religious diversity, religious experience, while monotheism is reductionist and it reduces everything to the singular, which they have to prove through special pleadings. I mean, I'm not going to dwell on manna because we talked about it last week, but some theorists have said that manna is the building block of polytheism. Why might it be the building block of polytheism? So, yeah, go on. Okay, so basically, it's a sacred substance, like we talked about last time. It's imbued and harnessed within objects and people. Now, why some view it as perhaps the building blocks of polytheism, it manifests in tribal societies because manna is actualized in the group. So it's about harnessing this power, this supernatural power, and directing it for utility to make your crops grow or whatever. And therefore, it's believed that that could be the building block of polytheism. What's the time? I'm just thinking, should we? I think we'll stop there. We've got the seminar.